Good morning from the Philippines. My name is Dominic Woodhouse. I'm the Executive Director of Mangrove Action Project. Delighted to be able to present the UN Decade of Restoration. My presentation is going to be on mangroves and mangrove restoration, specifically looking at shrimp aquaculture and restoring former shrimp ponds. So what I'll talk about is a little bit about us. What are mangroves and why they're different from terrestrial forestry? Why they're so special and why care about them? Some essential ecology to make sense of the rest of the presentation, what's happening with the current restoration activity, a brief introduction to our own approach to mangrove restoration before talking about aquaculture and the losses related to aquaculture, and also then restoring abandoned shrimp ponds. We're a small NGO based in the US, 501c3 non-profit. We do two main activities. One is a mangrove restoration training program. We call the mangrove restoration process community-based ecological mangrove restoration, and you'll hear that CBEMR along this presentation, and I'll talk about it in a bit more detail. We're fortunate to have done this around the world and been supported by some excellent funders and supporters with whom we've been working, and I'm very grateful for their support. The second product we have is a school's curriculum program called Marvelous Mangroves. This is for primary school kids to teach them about the values of mangroves and why they should conserve them, but also teaches teachers how to deliver this curriculum. And it's very hands-on, very applied, so you can see a lot of classroom-based activity and a lot of field trips to bring it all to life. Similarly, this has been run all around the world. We also do an awful lot of other activity. We run a photography competition, which has just been launched earlier this week by Leo and Laura. We campaign for the preservation of mangroves against the expansion of shrimp aquaculture. We run an art competition for children, which goes into an annual calendar. We campaign against mangrove destruction, such as the destruction of mangroves in Tanzania from an oil pipeline. And we encourage sustainable or supplementary livelihoods, such as honey production from the mangroves. We have a website that has an awful lot of excellent films on there, produced by Leo, Tom, and others that are informational and help people understand about mangrove biology, ecology, and restoration. And we also get approached by a lot of groups that want support or technical advice of how to restore mangroves. This is an example from Kenya. So, step one, what are mangroves and why are they special? What are they indeed? Mangroves can look really quite different, as you see here, the different types of mangroves. They're a tree-based ecosystem, tropics and subtropics only, because frost will kill them off. Probably cover about 0.5% of the land mass. They're special because they do two tricks. These trees are able to do two things that other trees cannot do. We know that salt damages trees. You can see this when you're spreading salt over the roads in countries that get snow in the winter. And you can see on the right-hand side here that the damage, or indeed the death, is caused by salt. Mangroves are able to tolerate salt. Salt will extract or draw the water out of the roots, putting plants into drought in effect. But mangroves have worked out a way of tolerating that and combating that. The second reason they are special is because they have adaptations for waterlogged soil. Waterlogged soil, as in a forest that's been flooded. If there's water standing on top of the soil, then there's very limited oxygen within the soil. And this makes life for the mangrove roots very difficult. So they have evolved different mechanisms in order to get oxygen down to the roots. And these are sort of breathing apparatus, if you will, pneumatophores in the terminology. If we have a look at one of these in slightly more detail, this is red mangrove, or Rhizophora, the iconic mangrove with the prop roots and the drop roots. We can see that on the roots here, there are little breathing holes. Air diffuses into these holes and then down into the roots and keeps the roots alive, even though the soil is rather wet. But this is an important point because it will affect how we see restoration later on. And there are different types of mangroves. There's fringe mangroves, thin little strips of mangroves. There's river delta mangroves, or scrub arid mangroves, and so on. And also lagoon mangroves. This is an example out of Sri Lanka. And there are some other examples of all types of mangroves: overwash, as it sounds, little islands with mangroves that get washed over, or basin mangroves, so in a delta, but the bottom of the mangroves has sunk a little bit and it's got a lot of sort of water sort of standing in it. So there are very sort of different types of mangroves. So that's a brief introduction to what mangroves are and why they're special. Why care about them? Well, they are incredibly productive and hugely valuable ecosystem, particularly if you imagine that you are a coastal villager with very few assets. Maybe you don't have a boat, you can't afford a boat, you can't afford a motorbike to get into town, nearest town for a work. Then you need to be able to produce a house, put a roof over your head, and find some food. Mangroves are able to allow these people to live sustainably without too many assets. So they're obviously sort of forest materials, such as a timber, nipper palm that can be woven into roofs and so on, wood in order to be able to cook rice, etc. But mangroves do so much more than that. They reduce erosion, they protect people from violent weather or storms or storm surges and big waves. They store an enormous amount of carbon, largely in the soil. The systems, particularly river delta systems, will clean water, reducing excess nutrients and sediment and heavy metal ions. It's a very biodiverse habitat. It provides a space for lots of animals to live, from sea eagles to Royal Bengal tigers to smaller animals. And it provides a sense of place for a lot of mangrove communities. If a village lives within a mangrove, it really sees itself as a mangrove community. So we estimate lost about half of the world's mangroves since the Second World War, and they're still being lost at about 0.6 or 0.4% a year. This average hides great variation. It's much higher in some countries and less in others. Don't forget that a lot of this productivity doesn't actually come from the trees itself. It also comes from the muddy surfaces and the mud. On top of the mud, there will be a film of algae and bacteria and fungi and so on. And this is also incredibly productive and the start of the inshore food web. So it's not just the trees, it's also the mud that is very, very productive. Okay. When we are trying to restore mangroves, we try to bring back what would be a natural mangrove, hopefully with all the other species, and in a way that mangroves normally work. So we need a good understanding of what do natural mangroves actually look like. The first thing to say about mangrove ecosystem is that it's very dynamic. Stuff moves around. Sand or mud gets deposited. As you can see, this tree here is sort of half buried up to its neck in soil. But there's also natural erosion, and this therefore causes natural dieback, or indeed natural colonization, where areas will receive more mud and more silt and more clay, and start to build up and enjoy natural colonization, as you can see here. What mangroves or natural mangroves don't look like is like this. Single species, same height, as you can see here. Even though a lot of people will believe that this is what mangrove should be like, or this is what mangrove is, actually this is planted mangrove after a charcoal concession has cleared a lot of area. This happens to be in Thailand, and then replanted by the government 20, 30 years ago. Similarly, this happens to be in the Philippines. This is not natural mangrove. This is planted mangrove, single species, often in lines, and so it's all at the same age, all at the same sort of height. Similarly, this is for sustainable charcoal, and as an objective in itself, that's absolutely fine, but this is not natural mangrove, not really what we're trying to take restored mangrove back to. Okay, we want to try and mimic nature and how natural mangrove would work, because this system works best. So I'm going to try and show you what we are trying to then mimic. So the first feature of a mangrove is that, especially in river delta mangroves or basin mangroves, we've got big, wide channels. A lot of water coming in and out of these systems, and the hydrology, the water flowing in and the water flowing out, the hydrology is incredibly important for mangroves. It circulates the seeds and propagules to allow them to find new areas to reproduce. It will bring in nutrients, it will bring in good bacteria. The mangroves will slow this water flowing out down a river and take the sediment out of it, so as the sediment doesn't smother the coral or the seagrass adjacent to the mangroves. And most importantly, these channels allow the mangroves to drain at low tide. So the water can get out of the soil and the oxygen can get into the soil. So if you look at a mangrove system from above, this happens to be Krabi, where I used to live in southwest Thailand, you can see that there's a lot of water going through this system and lots of little rivers going through it. There's lots of edges and lots of gradients, which is always useful for an ecosystem. The second thought is that natural mangroves, particularly the mid-mangrove and the back mangroves, are not flat. So this allows trees to grow up on the hill and the water to drain down into the channels, into the troughs, and then drain away. So at low tide, the water can leave the soil and the oxygen can diffuse down into the soil and keep the roots alive. And this is essential for a healthy mangrove. So if we have a site like this is in Tanzania, where there is standing water and very poor drainage, it's very difficult growing conditions for mangroves because there's very limited oxygen getting down into the roots. The third thought is that, in a sense, a mangrove is a bit messy. There's a variety of heights of trees, of light intensities. There are some more open spaces. There are some more densely packed areas and various different species. So we would want this variety because different trees want different sort of conditions and resources. Outside, it might look something like this, not straight lines, not all at the same height. This is from Professor Jean Yong, bless your heart, this fantastic ID chart. So this is a good example of the biodiversity that we're expecting to see. Now, it depends on which country you're in. Southeast Asia tend to have the most species, and as you go further away from that area, then there are fewer species. So Southeast Asia will have approximately 35 true mangrove species and say another 50 associated species. And as you go, say, towards the New World and the US, then there are only about 3 or 4 species. And the fifth thought is the mangrove species zone. Now, this is a diagram from Norm Duke, one of my mangrove heroes in the University of Queensland, out of his book, Australia's Mangroves. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail because this is an important thought. So what he's done here is done a diagram looking sideways at a mangrove, and he's divided it up into if it's downstream near the sea, or if it's intermediate, or if it's upstream much further towards terrestrial forestry. I'm just going to take one of these and simplify it a little bit. So if you have a look at the right-hand side here, there what I've tried to draw here or emphasize on Norm Duke's diagram is the high water, low water points, and then let's call it average sea level or mean sea level. So twice a day, most places, the water's going to move from low water to high water and low water to high water. So the water's going to come in and go out. And the first thought, my first thing to take out of this is that the mangroves live in the top half or maybe even the top third of this intertidal zone. They don't grow all the way down to low water. They stop at about average sea level or mean sea level, call it what you will. I've got a little GIF here. I love this. High water, low water, high water, low water. I can watch that all day. It's just great fun. So you can see the tide coming in, average and low, in, average and low. And so that emphasizes what I want to emphasize that is that the mangroves grow just within the top half of the intertidal zone, not the whole intertidal zone. The second thought is that within this top half of the intertidal zone, the different species like to live at different elevations relative to sea level. So if you look at the top here, right on the left-hand side, there is let's call it a back mangrove zone, a high mangrove zone. And there are species that are happy to live here. They get wet, say, only in the very highest tides and only for a brief period of time, 10, 20 minutes, half an hour. They like to keep their roots dry. It's probably sandy soil up at this elevation. And specific species like to live up here. Then there are species that like to live in the mid-mangrove zone. And bear in mind, these aren't sort of hard borders. There's obviously a lot of overlap between one species and the next. And then at the front mangrove, there's some specialist species, Avicennia marina, Sonoratia alba, that are happy to live down at the front around mean sea level, and they'll get wet twice a day for 2 or 3 hours of each tidal cycle. And then at some point at the front fringe, then mangroves will stop because it'll just be too difficult for mangroves to establish. So what does that front fringe look like? Well, it looks something like these different photos here at the bottom. So if you look at the left-hand photo, you can see that as the mangroves are just growing down the slope, downhill is to the left here, then you can see that the very front trees are just giving up and they are actually sort of dying off. You can see they're leafless. And unfortunately, there's some planting in front of that, which is obviously not going to work. In the middle, there's Rich Mackenzie's excellent photo, and that is the front fringe of the mangrove. And what those breathing apparatus show me, and particularly because they're so long, is that these trees are having to work very hard to survive this wet, saturated soil. And you can see that there is standing water, even though this is a low tide. There is standing water here on this mud, so the soil is saturated. There's very little oxygen in the soil. It's all full of water, and so therefore the trees are having to work very hard to keep their roots alive and get oxygen down into them. Now, importantly, from mean sea level or average sea level down to low water, then this is where we see mud flats, open areas that you can see in these two photos here. Crucially, this is not an area for mangroves. It's unsuitable for mangrove establishment, and you will see that nature is showing us this because there is no natural regeneration. Particularly on this photo on the left here, you'll see that it's just bald mud. There's nothing growing here at all. So importantly for restorers, this is not an area to start planting or working on because it is too low relative to sea level. And this is an important point. It will make more sense of the rest of the presentation. And then from low water down, we tend to get other ecosystems such as seagrass. The seagrasses can exist a little bit further up, but in general, seagrasses like to be covered by water. So from low water downwards, then we get seagrass beds and seagrass colonies. Again, their own incredibly important, very valuable, productive ecosystem. So in summary about what mangroves should look like, and therefore what we are trying to restore a mangrove to look like, we try to mimic this natural system as best as possible, including wide channels, natural hills and troughs for the hydrology and good drainage so the water can come in and out and then drain away. We want a full range of species, if at all possible, all the species there. We want different densities. There are going to be some dense areas, some more open areas, some lighter areas, some darker areas. Maximum biodiversity, if we can possibly achieve that. And remembering that within the tidal zone on our marine or coastal site, that the mangroves are going to exist in the top half of this intertidal zone only. And then within that, the species have preferred areas where they like to live. So therefore, if we are doing some restoration, we do need to know which zone, back mangrove zone, mid mangrove zone, front mangrove zone, or indeed mudflat, we need to know where the site is located. So, mangrove restoration, what's going on at the moment? Well, there's an awful lot of interest in mangroves and restoring mangroves because we've lost half since the Second World War, and people now appreciate just how valuable they are. Different objectives for different projects. Sometimes people want a green belt, a protective green belt. Some other times people want increased fisheries or wood production or whatever. Most mangrove restoration, I would suggest, is actually done by communities working with a government mangrove agency field office. A lot of this work is done, therefore, under the radar. There's very poor data that describes this work. That's not exclusively the only work that's going on. Some groups like WWF and CI and Blue Ventures are doing some excellent work in different countries around the world. But most of the work, the majority of the work, I think, is done by communities. So there's very poor data and very little independent verification of this. Is it successful? This is the crucial question. What's often reported as success is the fact that an area has been planted or a number of seedlings or a number of propagoules have been planted, and that is seen as success because they've all been deployed. We would suggest that success has got two elements to it. One is survivorship to at least a couple of years or so. Better it would be survivorship to reproductive maturity, so what you've managed to restore is itself reproducing, producing seeds and distributing them. The second is that we would also want to see some measures, some metrics of biodiversity. What do I mean by biodiversity? Well, in this case, we're talking about specifically trying to get all the species that are native to a particular area, a particular country, present on a restoration site, and present in a way that they are relatively evenly represented. It isn't just one example of one example of another, and then the rest is all one species. We want to see roughly even amounts of each species. This is hugely important because, like terrestrial forestry, if we only plant one species and it happens to get some pest or disease, some bud moth, or it's not particularly well suited to sea level rise and climate change, then we put all our eggs in one basket, and if we lose that species, then we've lost everything. So we really need to make sure that we have all the species back. Every species has an ecological role to play. Every species is important. Is a lot of this mangrove restoration working? Well, to be honest, no. From my own PhD research, but also writers like Samson and Rollon and Primavera and so on, when they've been looking at survivorship in these sort of systems, we are seeing an average of about 20% survivorship. But actually, because I'm averaging averages, I would suggest a median is a better score. My median survivalship was only 10%. So we could do an awful lot better. An example, again, is from the Philippines, bottom left-hand corner here. You can see just in the right-hand side of this photo, this little white house here. Mangroves have been planted all the way around to that white house. 35,000 plants are in that mudflat. There is not one that is alive. I've walked and struggled through that mud all the way around to that little white house and back again. Nothing has survived that planting at all. And unfortunately, like a lot of people in the mangrove world, I've got lots and lots of photos of mangrove restoration failure. So there is space to do this better. Here's another example. This is from the Philippines. A photo from El Verde Movement's Facebook page. This is a record-breaking 1 million propagals planted in an hour. 4 years later, I've been through this site again. I've gone through this area. These are people on the ground here, and there is no trace that they've been there. There's nothing surviving there at all. The survivorship is less than 2%, and the survivors are right at the top of this photo here, and they are hidden behind a sandbar here. About 20,000 survivors. Everything else has disappeared. What's frustrating is that this is a predictable failure, and if they had applied the science, then they know that that site was inappropriate. First sign was, as soon as you get on site, you can see that a previous seawall has been smashed up at some point. So this is a high-energy site, and mangroves don't like high-energy sites. They tend to get washed away. The second thing is that this area where they've been planting, this is a different view actually from Google Earth, you can see that the local people moor their boats here. They park their boats here. So they don't want mangroves here in the first place. And also, it's open ocean facing. So we know that as this is facing the open ocean, it's going to be highly energetic at some point. And on that site where we saw all those people, there's no natural regeneration, but there is a lot of standing water. So we know this is going to be a very difficult site, and it's predictably difficult. And it's just unfortunate that they chose that site to try and break that record. Again, there's a lack of observation of nature here, which is greatly unfortunate. Sorry, the picture has pixelated a bit. In the background, we can see some short, shrubby, highly salt-tolerant species, Abyssinia marina and Cereops tegal. This tells us that this site is fairly salty at some point in the year, particularly obviously in the dry season. What they've been planting here is far less salt-tolerant species, and unfortunately these are very, very unlikely to survive. Similarly, there's no natural regeneration here, so nature is telling us something, that this is not going to be an appropriate site. If this planting does survive, so this is so low it's actually in the seagrass beds, then all we're doing is swapping one ecosystem for another. And seagrass is incredibly valuable. There's no point replacing seagrass with mangroves. Some other more amusing photos. I think the military officer on the left-hand side here is probably depressed at having to lose the edge of his blade, having to dig mangroves into coral, which are clearly unsuitable. On the top right here, we can see some rhizophora being planted in what is very obviously an Abyssinia zone. You can see by the breeding roots, the little pencils sticking up here, that this is not a rhizophora zone. So what's happening and can we summarize these planting failures? Well, there are probably two reasons that my own research and other people's research have really sort of identified as to why these things are not why this restoration is not working. The first is that they're often choosing the wrong site. It's poor site choice. And this is often because they're working in this mudflat area, so from average sea level down to low water. The second reason why a lot of these projects fail from a biophysical point of view is that then, having chosen an appropriate site, they're then putting the wrong species into those sites, or just poor so-called site species matching. So they might take a mangrove that is suitable for mid-zone, let's say Rhizophora stylosa, Rhizophora mucronata, apiculata, and might plant it right down low, below the front mangrove zone, or right up at the back, almost in the terrestrial zone. There are other reasons why mangrove projects either will struggle or fail. Many of them social as well as biophysical. Biophysical could be things like grazing pressure, so animals come through and eat everything. But social, a lack of involvement of the local people, which is absolutely vital, or a lack of agreement to keep grazing animals out of a restoration area. So there's lots to think about in terms of mangrove restoration. Okay, so what would we suggest as an NGO? Community-based ecological mangrove restoration has really been distilled and developed by the late Robin Lewis, who used to be our technical director. And this is born out of the science, but also of 30, 40 years of his own field experience. And if for the more academically minded, it's summarized in Ecological Engineering for Successful Management, which is the paper from 2004, 2005. So here's an example. I'm going to talk through this because this is a good illustration of his process. So what's happened here is that these are mangroves in Florida, and a road has been built on the left-hand side. You can just about see the chain link there. And what's happened is that in the process of building the road, they've cut off the hydrology, and these mangroves have died. So what Robin has done is to dig this channel to replace the hydrology, to make sure that the water can now come in and go out effectively. And what he's also done is then regraded, changed the height relative to sea level, changed the height of this soil to make sure that this soil here, from the edge of the channel back to where the forest is at the appropriate height for mangrove development, so in the top half of the intertidal zone. And then has just left it. No planting, no nursery necessary. 27 months it looks like this, and 5 years later it looks like that. It's come back. All the species are present, all the species in roughly the appropriate zone. So the key to this is restoring the hydrology and allowing then nature to heal itself. Now, there are a couple of things that we would do differently. We've sort of learned. Ideally, the channels are not necessarily in straight lines, because if you look at a river from above, it bends and it winds, and that slows the water down and allows the sediment to drop out. The second thing is that we wouldn't necessarily do a parallel-sided channel. It's much more sensible, like nature again, to have a channel that is narrower at the top and wider at the bottom. The channel dynamics like that means that the speed of the water at the bottom end of the channel keeps that whole area clear. It stops it silting up. But the idea is there that if we recreate the natural conditions here, the hydrology, then mangroves will come back on their own. So to summarize this process, and this is the one sort of text-heavy chart, you have to forgive me, I'm going to talk through our CBMR approach. So what often happens on a site is that people will arrive all enthusiastic, will build a nursery because that's what terrestrial planters normally do, and then get out and plant. We won't have a look at why the mangroves were lost in the first place, why it is naturally regenerating. We'll just develop a nursery and then plant, take some photos, put up a signboard, and that's it. So our approach, our CBMR approach, starts with the local community and the local stakeholders. They need to be engaged. I mean, ideally, it's their project and they call us in, but we engage them, build their capacity, explain what's going on, and make sure that they feel that they are managing this process, and we are technical help, technical cheerleaders, if you will. We need to do a lot of research on the proposed site, looking at the hydrology, understanding the mangrove stresses, what local species are there or should be there. Is it a salty site, the salinity, but also the social issues? What's affecting the site? How do local people use the mangrove? The site history, what's been attempted before, etc., etc., etc. A lot of research at the site. We would also encourage people to look at a natural reference mangrove to see what nature should look like, hopefully as close as possible in a similar elevation, in a similar sort of ecological setting, if you will. So therefore we understand the changes of what happened to the site and what do we need to do, the problems that need to be corrected. We talk together, we plan and agree. We're very keen on mapping this process so as everybody can understand exactly where we're going to work and what we're going to do, particularly if literacy is more of a challenge. And we need to make sure that all the key stakeholders share the same objectives. We can't have one group wanting a green belt protection and another group wanting wood production or timber production. Then we implement. It might be correcting changes or problems that have happened before, perhaps blocked hydrology or the hydrology has been diverted. But it could also be just removing mangrove stresses and implementing social changes. It might need fencing. It might need supplementary livelihoods. It might need just capacity building or awareness of the values of mangroves to encourage people to extract much less. We then monitor to make sure that what we have done is appropriate, and then we will plant if there's not enough natural regeneration coming because there aren't enough local seeds and propagules coming into site. Okay, so specifically talking about aquaculture ponds and taking them back to mangrove, what should we be talking about? A lot of mangrove has been converted into aquaculture ponds starting from the 1980s or so, often supported by big groups. So these areas that are naturally very productive and will include shrimp production have been converted and look a bit like this. Why are we particularly interested in shrimp ponds, and why did I want to talk about this in the UN Decade of Restoration launch? Well, there are literally hundreds of thousands of hectares of abandoned ponds globally, and they're sitting there idle, really not doing very much. We saw at the beginning of why they're so valuable, because they provide all these ecosystem goods and services. They produce fish and timber. They protect people from storms and erosion and so on and so on. If they're just abandoned, they look like this. So they provide no good ecosystems services or products. And actually, the most productive use I've seen of an abandoned pond is this, where the local people were playing football in it in the evening. The ponds are often sited in the right place in sort of mid-mangrove zone, mid-mangrove elevation. So these abandoned ponds are at the right sort of height. And from our point of view, we're always slightly concerned that if they are not returned to mangrove, then maybe another department of a government might try and put them into some other form of production, such as oil palm, which often doesn't really work because the soil is too salty, or it will get flooded and become too salty. So the oil palm productivity is very poor. We would much rather get these areas back to functioning productive mangrove. There are a lot of other problems that we need to think about. It's a complicated program. Primarily land tenure. Land tenure around these aquaculture ponds is often very difficult. The local people will not want to give them up, even if they're abandoned, even if they're not using them, because they hope that the land price will increase or the shrimp price might increase. Unfortunately, there's a lot of organized crime around shrimp. There's just too much money in it, and villages have been murdered, groups have been moved forcibly, or they're just sort of land grabs and other sort of local mangrove stresses. We might find that the NGO is actually in competition for restorable land with the government. So an NGO might find some shrimp ponds that they want to restore, but the government takes it over because they need to fulfill their quotas of area planting or propagule planting. The ponds themselves, and also there might be other local sources of pollution. And we've found also from our experience that villagers fear that if a pond returns to become mangrove, then as the state often owns mangroves in many countries, then it automatically becomes state land and they lose control of it, they lose it. So there's lots of sort of local social problems that we need to try and counter. So here's an example I'm going to talk through for the end of the presentation. This is a pond that I restored in Bangladesh in Krabi with some excellent villagers. And it's more of a biophysical example, but I also talk about the social area. So we're down in southwest Thailand here. And it's on the bottom photo on the right hand side up at the top. you can see those two pins there. That's where the pond is that I'm going to talk about. So 2009, February, it looks like this. As you can see, you can see the pond wall around it. There is nothing in it. There's yours truly in their red circle there. My wife says that's a very good look for me. A photo about 100 meters away and low resolution. So this is what it's like at this point. You can see that there is nothing growing in there. So a bit of history of the site. It used to be former mangrove. It's converted into an aquaculture pond. It's about 0.7 of a hectare or so. It was abandoned 10 years before we got to it in 2009. And then in the 5 years before we got to it, it has been tidally flushed. So this water gate or sluice gate, you can see, has eroded on the left-hand side. So the water was actually coming in and out perfectly well. So it was hydrologically reconnected. However, the question is, this area is surrounded by mangroves. There's seeds and propagules in the water the whole time. Why is there no natural regeneration? So we did a lot of site research and site measuring. We also did a lot of social research and talked a lot with the local community. Lots of propagules and seeds on site. You can see all the mangroves all around the back, and they are all producing mangroves and dropping it into the water. The answer is that there is very poor drainage. You can see the standing water here because because the soil is too low. The soil has sunk. And so therefore there is no natural regeneration. So this the soil is flat, the water can't flow away, and the soil is too low, so it's underwater for too much of each tidal cycle. And that is inhibiting any mangrove natural regeneration. Okay, why is it too low? How come the bottom of the pond has sunk and is now too low? Because it used to be formerly mangrove. So when the pond was made out of this mangrove area, the pond is cleared and it's mechanically flattened. So they would get a bulldozer like this to scrape the flat, scrape flat the floor of the mangrove and push the mud to the side to produce these walls that you can see here on the right-hand side. And the weight of those machines compacts the soil. It squeezes the soil down, so it lowers the level of the soil. Now we've killed off all the mangroves, the remaining roots in the soil, they die off and decay, and so their root spaces also collapse. So the soil shrinks further. And then there's further soil shrinkage when the soil pore water is lost due to evaporation when the pond is abandoned a few years later because they were often managed rather poorly. So for all these reasons, the soil has been reduced and squeezed and compressed and so on, and so therefore has sunk. So if I was going to illustrate it, what's happened is that we've gone from, say, a mid-zone area, if you remember here, having Marinus rhizophorus stylo sort of zone, and the pond floor has literally been lowered or sunk down to a sort of mudflat area below average sea level. So therefore the natural regeneration really struggles to re-establish because the soil is too saturated for too long. There's not enough oxygen in it, and it's just too difficult for mangrove establishment. So what do? Well, as always, we start with a lot of discussion with the community. We did a lot of site research and social research. We had a look at the natural mangroves around the site to see what nature does look like, what species should be there, the soil conditions, the salinity, etc. Normally, we would start by reconnecting an aquaculture pond to the outside hydrology. But here we were fortunate because, as I said, it was already open. This had already eroded, as you can see, 2009 and actually 2013 when I went back, it's eroded even further. But the water is flowing in and out of here. So we were lucky. But the first stage of aquaculture ponds is always to reconnect the hydrology to the outside world. So the water can come in and also drain down at the same speed as all the other water in the surrounding mangroves drains down. So our objectives was that we agreed with the village that we would return this pond to mangrove. It would hopefully be a very productive pond, and actually I caught these guys putting a net across the water gate at high tide, and it was amazing how much they pulled out of this pond. It was literally a 25-litre paint bucket, an empty paint bucket full of fish and crab and octopus. They had a snake in there, all sorts of things. It was fantastically productive and really great to see. They could also obviously get some goods and services out of this pond when it came back to mangrove, and the village were very happy with that. What we were doing was also testing a whole load of things, channel improvements, some hill stability. I'll talk about that in a second. What equipment we could do, and could we restore this pond and make it come back, but very cheaply, very simply, with just shovels, no expensive equipment, no mechanical equipment. So what we did was a lot of digging and then some direct planting by me, just inserting the plants, and that seemed to bring back an awful lot of natural regeneration of other species. And I'll show you in a moment. What we would have done is so the original sluice gate that you can see is here in the bottom left-hand corner. What we would have done is also reconnect it here, because this was a suitable area to reconnect, but unfortunately we weren't allowed to put another hole through the wall there. So the solution was to try and improve the drainage and try and make sure that the water drains down as quickly as possible, but also produce some land at an appropriate elevation for mangrove establishment. So you can see all these hills here, these little hillocks, like mud lobster hills. These were much higher and actually quite suitable for mangroves, because the soil in those hills would drain down enough, and it would be dry enough for enough of the tidal cycle to allow mangroves to establish. Now, I made two mistakes here. That the sides of these channels, this is right at the beginning, the sides of the channels are too vertical. They need to be bent over, and the mud piles need to be much further back from the edge of the channel, because otherwise the mud just slops back down into the channel. But you can see the principle of it. So this was a slightly more appropriate channel where I was digging sort of V-shape channels to improve the hydrology. And this would allow the water to drain out much more quickly. The soil drainage improved greatly. The sides of the channels are 45 degrees or even more, and obviously wider towards the sluice gate and not straight. So we did a lot of digging. Now, on this site, the pond entrance is here at the bottom left. There were some natural channels that I improved and dug out and made deeper. And then there are some slight natural channels, the red ones here, that I also dug out to try and improve the hydrology and the drainage. And with those hillocks of soil that I was digging out, then we labeled them. We tested all sorts of different things on this hill. So the mounds look like mud lobster mounds, and they are high enough for mangrove establishment. And then we did lots of different tests on all these different things. And happily, 2017, it now looks like that. And actually, in bottom right-hand corner in 2020, you can see that it's largely come back. So what we found was that with a bit of direct planting, and a bit of natural regeneration, it seemed to encourage a lot of the other species to come back. And though the front of what you can see here is Rhizophora, red mangrove, as you go further towards the top of the mangrove, there are another 10 or 12 species in here. So it's suitably biodiverse, which is also really encouraging. So in summary, in terms of aquaculture pond restoration, we need to make sure that there is some appropriate legal method to take back long-term control of this pond. We don't want to do all this work and then 5 years later they just clear it again. And it has to be acceptable to the village. We need to make sure that there is support from the Mangrove Agency, the local government unit, and the community for this work, that they are enthusiastic or indeed they can help. For shrimp ponds specifically, we need to check the elevation of the pond floor and see if it is too high or it's too low. We can't assume that it is the appropriate height for mangrove relative to sea level. So if you remember, the mangroves grow in the top half of the intertidal zone between high water and low water. They're in the top half, so we need to check that elevation. We should start off by reconnecting the hydrology, because this washes out the pollution. The pond floors are often full of antibiotics, herbicides, pesticides, shrimp feed, dead shrimp, shrimp feces, all sorts of nasty things, and tend to be very, very acidic. So reconnecting the hydrology will wash out and clean a lot of that pollution. And seawater being slightly alkaline will reduce slowly the acidity of the pond floor soil, so that makes it more appropriate for mangrove growth. We need to make sure that there are enough seeds and seeds and propagules that are being brought in on the water, and make sure that as the water goes out at each falling tide, that the drain down speed, the speed the water is going out, is the same as the rest of the surrounding mangroves. So if therefore the area has got no water in it for 4 hours or 6 hours of each tidal cycle, that should be the same inside the pond as it is outside the pond. And if the pond floor is flat with poor drainage, as we saw there, a lot of standing water, then we need to try and improve this hydrology. So perhaps with a shovel, improve the existing channels and put the spoil into piles, which lets the water flow around them. And then on those piles or mud mounds, then we can either encourage natural regeneration or indeed just direct plant, whichever. And finally, in terms of all our discussions, we need to make sure that everyone shares the same objectives. That when we were talking with the village, we wanted to test lots of things, but at the end of the day, they were going to get a natural biodiverse mangrove, which they were happy with, and they were going to look after it for the ecosystem services that are provided, such as fisheries productivity, protection from storm and wind, and so on. So everyone agreed to the same objectives, and that is obviously essential. So thank you very much for your attention. Please reach out to Mangrove Action Project if you have questions about Mangrove Restoration Project. Either you're a funder or you're an NGO trying to restore an area of mangrove. Always very happy to assist and encourage, maybe share some advice, and maybe even do a CBMR workshop. Thank you very much for your attention.